You know, guys, with all this news of conference realignment, with the whole Texas-Oklahoma move to the SEC, I think it's important to discuss what Ohio State should do, because Ohio State's in a really weird position right now, and I really think there's three main options for the Buckeyes when it comes to reacting to this conference realignment, making the SEC basically a complete super conference. You have three options. Number one, you stay in the Big Ten. Number two, you leave the Big Ten and join another conference. Or number three, you go independent. Now, when it comes to the least likely option, I would say joining another conference. I have heard people throw out, rumors that Ohio State's going to join the SEC. Folks, let's just get it on the record right now. If Ohio State goes to the SEC is basically the Premier League. Now, I don't watch soccer, but what soccer has is basically a bunch of all the top teams in one league. And that's what, if Ohio State goes to the SEC, that's what the SEC is. Because then Clemson would be forced to go there as well, and it would just create a Premier League where all of the best teams are in one league. I think that's the least likely scenario of Ohio State joining another conference, joining the SEC, and it becoming just one big mega league. People have talked about the SEC, expanding to 32 teams as big as that. I don't think that's going to happen. The other two options that are viable right now, you either stay in the Big Ten, which at that point, the Big Ten's looking at possibly adding, either Iowa State or Kansas maybe. I don't know. We obviously have heard of the Pac-12 idea where you try and go get Oregon or USC, because really the Big Ten just doesn't have many options right now if we don't get Notre Dame. If Notre Dame goes to the ACC, which people would expect to happen, they were in the conference last year during the COVID year. Now, Notre Dame kind of has a weird relationship in terms of other sports. In lacrosse, I think they're a member of the Big Ten. In hockey, I know they're a member of the Big Ten. And in basketball, I know they're a member of the ACC. So it's like they're kind of split there. But last year, during the COVID season, they joined the ACC. So we can all surmise and all think Notre Dame will probably be joining the ACC when all of these other conferences expand. We can expect the Big Ten to expand by 2 teams. There's been talks about Kansas possibly joining the Big Ten. That would be good in terms of basketball, we know, but the football team is one of the worst football teams in FBS. And when you look at your Ohio State, there are a number of factors at play. The independent option is very interesting. And personally, I love the idea of Ohio State being independent and not having to play Michigan State every year. Traveling to different places, playing a bunch of different teams. I love that idea. If people are really, obsessed with it, you can keep the Michigan rivalry. You can keep that game as the last game of the season. Personally, I don't care one way or the other if we keep the Michigan rivalry. It is what it is. After last year with the whole COVID thing, Michigan players didn't get COVID on purpose, but they probably told them, you're on Thanksgiving break, we're 30-point underdogs. If you got COVID, it probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I mean, Michigan was literally, by Vegas, 30-point underdogs to Ohio State. Them, having COVID, oh my goodness, what an excuse, right? To me, the rivalry just is kind of dead. It just feels dead. There's nothing to it, but if you want to continue the rivalry with Michigan as an independent, we could do that. It could still be the last game of the season, regular season. The main argument against going independent is the idea you don't have that 13th data point or whatever, whatever they say on ESPN, to where there's no conference championship. And it's like with Notre Dame right now, where we have the 4-team playoff, right? Notre Dame is in a position to where they cannot lose. They have zero margin for error because they're an independent, and you cannot make up that one loss by winning a conference championship. So Notre Dame has to go undefeated to get into the college football playoff. How does that get mitigated? The playoff's going to expand. That's how it gets mitigated. The playoff goes to a 12 team. It becomes 12-team. Now it's a 12-team playoff. So many more teams are going to get in. Even if you lose a game and you're an independent and you don't have a conference championship game, you can still, in a 12-team playoff, very easily get in the playoff. That's why the idea of becoming an independent becomes a lot more viable. If we stay at a 4-team, or even if it just goes to an 8-team, which, again, everybody thinks with this move of Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC, we all think it's going to 12-team. It's going to be a 12-team playoff, right? The more teams, the better, the more revenue. And this just is a great excuse now that the SEC is so competitive, you got to get more teams in there. We understand that. If it had just stayed at 4 teams, I would say no way do you go independent. It's far too risky. You remember Ohio State losing to Penn State, with the kick 6 and whatever. We would not have made the playoff that year, losing that one game because there would have been no conference championship if we were independent. because we were a member of the Big Ten, we beat probably Wisconsin, whoever it was, either Wisconsin or Northwestern in the conference championship. That gives us a 13th data point. That gives us Big Ten champions. That ups our resume significantly, and that's why we got into the playoff as one of the 4 teams. The exclusivity of the playoff loses a little steam when you go from 4 to 12 teams. An expansion times 3. 4 times 3 is 12. You're going from 4 to 12 teams. And it creates the idea to where you could even lose a game even as an independent without a conference championship and still make the college football playoff because it's 12 teams. So it's like the idea of being an independent, and now you don't have to face Michigan State every year. You don't have to face, all these other teams, Nebraska, whatever. You can travel the country. You can go to different places. Ohio State can market themselves as the premier program of college football. You're always facing different people. It helps with recruiting, whatever. I think the independent option is really interesting. Financially, obviously, Ohio State generates a bunch of money for the Big Ten. They make a lot of money from the Big Ten. I don't know how happy they would be about leaving the Big Ten Conference. The main issue the Big Ten has right now, so the SEC was already better than the Big Ten in football, and now it's like there's no teams. Legitimately, it would have been one thing if, the SEC took Kansas or took Kansas and Texas, and we got Oklahoma. And the Big Ten got Oklahoma. That would be really good. That would kind of balance the power a little bit. The SEC would still have more better teams, but it would balance it. They took the 2 best teams in the Big 12, and now people are like, oh, go get Iowa State. You think Iowa State, once Matt Campbell leaves, is going to be any good? I actually think Iowa State's an overrated team this year. I think they lose 3 or 4 games in an underrated, pretty tough Big 12 this year. So it's like Iowa State is not a legitimate option. That once they lose Matt Campbell, Brock Purdy, whatever, Breece Hall, they all leave. They're all seniors. They're going to go back to losing 7-8 games, whether it be in the Big 12 or the Big 10 if they come along. And then it's like you add Kansas State and Iowa State. That is not a good option, man. Our conference becomes really weak at that point. But again, it's at the point where it's like, if you're Ohio State, you have to sit back and be like, realistically, we understand, we're not even going to try and argue, we're a better conference than the SEC. But realistically, Ohio State has to sit back and say, our conference is so weak and it expands to 12 teams, right? So we could even lose a regular season game in the Big Ten. All we have to do is win the Big Ten championship game. We're automatically in the college football playoff. Easy, right? Because it expands to 12 teams. 4 or 5 of those teams very well could be from the SEC with how strong that conference is, but that still leaves 6, 7, 8 spots available. So you're going to get one of those spots as long as you win the Big Ten, even with probably 2 losses. So realistically for Ohio State, once the playoff expands to the 12 teams, I think their best option, you could, market yourself probably better by being an independent, facing different teams every single year. But what would be easier for Ohio State? Just stay in the Big Ten. Even if you lose a game or 2, just win the conference. You'll be in the playoff every single year. Now whether you get the 1st, 2nd, 3rd seed, whatever, we're probably not going to have the best resume with all those SEC teams and how tough their schedules are going to be. But just get in the playoff. That should be the goal. So it's like, the 2 main options I see, either becoming independent or staying in the Big Ten. This idea of creating kind of a super league just doesn't make any sense to me. And then the other idea where it's like, well, you can add teams like Oregon, USC. What's the point of having regions? Or what's the point of having divisions if we're adding teams from the West Coast to the Big Ten? I just don't understand that. The thought is the ACC gets Notre Dame, the Big Ten gets Iowa State, and maybe Kansas. That's what I've seen right now. We'll have to wait and see for, I know the Big Ten's been in talks with Kansas. Kansas contacted the Big Ten when this whole thing broke with Oklahoma and Texas going to the SEC. So again, a lot of this is at play. It's just interesting to see from Ohio State. I think their best move, it's boring, I know, but their best move was probably remaining in the Big Ten and just beating up on the Big Ten teams. That's Ohio State's best move at this point. The independent idea is really interesting. I think money is going to keep that from happening. A lot of money is tied up with Ohio State and with the Big Ten, and we know Ohio State's been a member of the Big Ten for so long now that it would be kind of a historic thing, whatever they leave the conference. Some people don't want that to happen. It is what it is. But those are just kind of the 2 main options for Ohio State. Become an independent, stay in the Big Ten, hope they add teams, and really just beat up on teams in the Big Ten. But you guys see why the independent option, it's viable now. Because you could literally lose a game, not have a conference championship, and still make the playoff. Because we know Ohio State's one of the top 4 most talented teams in college football. They constantly have a top at least 3 or 4 recruiting class every year in college football. So it's like you lose a game, you don't have a conference championship, who cares? There's 12 teams in the playoffs. You're going to make it. The talent is not a question. They'll put you in the playoff. So that's why the independent option becomes more viable. I think the best thing Ohio State can do, remain in the Big Ten, beat up on Big Ten teams. It's boring, I know. I would love to face, have a schedule where we face Oregon, USC, Clemson. It's just more fun for the fan. I understand that. It's like, why do we have to keep facing, Michigan State every year? I'm picking on Michigan State. I'm sorry. But it's just like these teams, we'll go to East Lansing and win 52-3. It's like, well, it's just kind of boring. I don't know. But it is what it is. It's whatever. That's kind of just the nature of conference play and facing the same teams every year. That's just how you got to deal with it. But guys, interesting situation from an Ohio State point of view. I think they remain in the Big Ten. The Big Ten's probably going to add 2 teams to the conference. We'll have to see what those 2 teams are. They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place if they don't get Notre Dame to join. We will see what ends up happening. But guys, make sure you follow me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description. I'm, of course, the Depressed Ginger. Thank you for watching.